people have this picture of Scotland, particularly the Highlands, of these sort of rolling hills and whatnot. You know, that was historically all forest.
Reduction in woodland cover throughout history. That's been at the same time as hill farming has been increasing through the years, particularly up to the 20th century. The natural development of woodland can be completely checked if you have grazing animals like sheep, basically eating any natural regeneration that takes place. And today, there aren't as many sheep around in the hillsides for economic reasons and changes in European subsidy regimes, but we're finding that deer numbers have grown over the last 100 years or so, and they are now also often checking regeneration in a lot of places.
The deer population is probably far, far larger than it should be, specifically red deer populations, which are not necessarily being controlled by hunting and bad weather.
So there's this balance between woodland growth and natural regeneration and the amount of herbivory affecting the landscape.
The Scottish Forestry Commission has set an ambitious target to extend woodland cover by 100,000 hectares by 2022. This would significantly contribute to the reduction of atmospheric CO2 and would provide a vital habitat for many native species. Herbivore control by predators like wolves would actively assist the restoration of woodlands, and this alone remains a strong argument for their reintroduction.
When people talk about reintroduction, they're mainly thinking about animals, species that used to be native to Scotland and are no longer here, they've gone extinct in the country. But in terms of predators, wolves and lynx as well, it is that sort of missing predation element of our ecosystems. So if you have a predator and they're carnivorous, they're going to look at deer populations as a potential source of prey, and that will affect how those deer behave in the landscape. And so they're not likely to reside as much, they need to move around the landscape more, and that's going to affect the extent to which they can reproduce and the demands on them. So it'll affect their distribution, it'll affect how long they can impact on an area of vegetation, and that'll give more areas time for that sort of vegetative growth to happen. If you think about woodland, time for trees to grow, because they've got a bit of respite from deer being moved on by the top predator.
Extensive research following the successful reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the 90s has revealed how an apex predator can elicit dynamic ecological changes that ripple down the food chain in a process known as trophic cascades. Wolf-induced changes to herbivore density and behaviour enabled increased recruitment of vegetation in certain areas of the park as expected. However, quite remarkably, a vast array of different species appeared to benefit from the environmental changes associated with the re-establishment of wolves, including various species of rodents, songbirds, scavengers, and other herbivores. Many ecologists believe that whole ecosystem functionality can be enhanced in the presence of top-down predator control.
It was a simplistic view of keeping herbivore numbers in check. In the Yellowstone case, it was wapiti, the American version of the red deer. But there was positive elements that no one foresaw. In Scotland, we're dealing with an environment that almost all of it has been altered by humans. But I mean, the ecological element is not to be overlooked, and it would be obviously fantastic to see, okay, we know what happened in Yellowstone, what sort of effects would we see in a Scottish environment?
Whilst habitat loss and fragmentation pose the greatest threat to biodiversity worldwide, there is increasing pressure arising from the introduction of invasive species, disease, pollutants, and climate change.
Once natural processes are operating, then it can become a more complicated and dynamic series of habitats. So if we have a more diverse system, then it's able to cope with more change that comes to it, whether that's from climate change or from disease. This kind of changing dynamic ecology makes the ecosystems in general a more resilient entity.
Humans depend heavily on the services provided by natural systems, from clean air and water to essential resources like food, timber and fuel. These provisions are known as ecosystem services. And with growing pressure from politicians and from the public to justify expenditure on everything, including conservation, getting enhanced ecosystem services from healthy, thriving ecosystems can be seen as a justification for ecological restoration projects.
Well, this is the ecosystem services debate. That's the current sort of buzz phrase. So that's carbon storage, inhibiting floodwater, soil improvement. The These are all things that nature can provide us if we allow it to operate. I think that principle is widely accepted. How that trades as currency in the debate, that's a bit harder. We can talk generally about how a species like, take the wolf, say we had wolves back and deer numbers came down and that meant we had more trees and more woodland and natural habitat growing. We could say, well, that's going to provide a range of ecosystem services. We'll get more soil conservation, we'll get more carbon stored, we'll slow down floods, and those benefit everybody. But a lands manager who's involved in a specific project might say, well, that's all very well for society, but that's costing me land that I could graze sheep on, or land that I could take deer from and sell that stocking to a client. So the conversation becomes about how does society allow for that individual cost for the benefit that we're all getting.
The biggest opposition to predator reintroductions comes from the agricultural industry, with fears over livestock predation driving much of the anti-wolf discourse.
I have great problems with the reintroduction of wolves here. What we're trying to do is produce livestock, and basically what the wolves are wanting to do is eat it before we can sell it, so our source of profit is gone. I've lived through the reintroduction of sea eagles, and they've basically made a lot of sheep farms on the west coast unviable because the lambs are taken, they steal the lambs, kill them. It goes for the easiest prey, and the easiest prey is domestic livestock. I mean, the introduction of wolves along with that would just finish farming in the Highland area.
I think it would be eminently possible to have sheep farming and predators coexisting. There's lots of countries where that is currently the case. Your average sheep farmer in the Highlands is looking to obviously not have his sheep killed. But then more sheep are killed by foot rot and bad farming than they are by any number of predators. There are mechanisms out there that could actually stop them being predated. Using old technology like sheep guarding dogs, dogs that live with the sheep, or llamas and donkeys are also good for chasing predators away. The other thing is with released animals, you're going to have them radio collared. So we're going to know exactly where they are. If it looks like the wolf pack is moving towards this particular farmer's ground, then we can go out there and chase them back. We need to help the agricultural industry to understand what's possible.
Wolves and other large carnivores are now widespread throughout much of Western Europe, with natural recolonisations from Eastern Europe and some reintroduction programmes aiding this revival. Conflict with livestock prompted research aiming to identify ways of mitigating the problem. Various strategies have been employed across farms throughout Europe, from changes to livestock management with night corrals, shepherding, and dogs to guard sheep, to new technologies such as guard boxes that produce wolf sounds to scare off approaching packs.
Different systems that are used in different countries, different landscapes make for different things. Naturally, the sheep here are hefted to an area, so they can't transiently graze them around other people's areas to keep moving them and shepherding them away from the wolves. There's a lot of fences there, and just whether you would have the people to go and do the work, it would need a whole cultural change.
But they use all these controls in Norway, and it doesn't work. There'll always be a lamb that'll stray out to the edge of the flock and be snaffled out with the eyesight of the guard dog or the alpaca or whatever. They're not 100% successful. They're a partial answer.
Compensation schemes are in place widely across North America and Europe to minimise the impacts of wild carnivores on livestock producers by financially reimbursing them for any losses.
If you look at predator legislation in Scandinavia, for example, they generally have pretty generous compensation schemes. Having something like that in place, as long as you have, anti-predator controls, or you expect a degree of offtake by predators a year, and you're compensated accordingly for that.
You can't be compensated for the heartbreak of going out and seeing something that you might have spent, well, in my example, 20 years breeding to get to that stage, or even longer, a lifetime breeding, and you go out and one of your best lambs has been killed. You can't be compensated for that.
Most farmers live for their animals rather than the other way around, and it's ingrained in them, this desire to look after them.
It's not all about money. People seem to think that they can throw money at a thing. I don't do this job for money, because if I did, I would have left it long ago. It's about the pleasure and the pride in producing an animal to the best of your ability.
I got asked a question by a member of the agricultural industry. And he said, well, okay, what if you've got one of these wolves and it starts to regularly kill livestock on my farm? And I said, well, you shoot it. And I said, you didn't expect me to say that. You know, you have your stereotypes of what a conservationist should or shouldn't say, or will or won't say. And using lethal control has to be a part of the conservation plan for almost any species, and particularly in somewhere like Western Europe. Even if they weren't taking out livestock, we probably would end up controlling numbers, or, right, you know, we need to remove the males from that group and introduce some new ones for genetic diversity within that pack. The ways of actually getting people like the farmers on site, that once they realise that if there's a problem, it needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with in a fairly blatant way. And once they get their head around that idea, then I think, you know, more will be open to the idea of predators, in this case wolves, coming back.
If we're going to reintroduce them and they'll run about and we'll compensate you. People don't like the idea of compensation, whereas control would bring an element of control into someone's own hands. I would certainly see that as a more, I wouldn't call it acceptable, but less upsetting option than just the thought of, oh, you'll get a few quid, stop moaning about your sheep.
The last wolves in the UK were hunted to extinction during the 18th century. A lot of the bad reputation this species has attained over the years can be attributed to mythology and folklore. Fairy tale depictions of a ferocious killer of humans, leading to a widespread misunderstanding of the threat posed by this shy and elusive predator.
Predator animals were hunted out for a reason. A lot of that reason wasn't necessarily agriculture.
It was because they were predatory and dangerous. They'll kill people. If there's children, they will kill them. Will it take for people to be killed before they decide, oh, maybe it wasn't such a good idea?
People's perception of wolves and the hazards that might surround them, be they real or imagined, a lot of it can be traced straight back to Little Red Riding Hood.
Nobody will go into the wildlife park in Kilcraig and climb in with the wolves.
I mean, we work in with our wolves here. Every zoo that I've worked at with wolves, you always worked on, there was never any problems. And people are amazed by that, but even when you look at the statistics, it's infinitesimally small, the chances of someone being attacked by a wild wolf. Historically in Europe, the episodes where there was like a lot of kids killed by wolves in villages, most of it looks like it was down to wolves that were rabid. And obviously we don't have rabies in the UK, so that's not going to be a particular issue. There is this view that, you know, certain things are dangerous and we accept it. Something brand new that used to be in our environment is maybe a tiny little bit dangerous, but we're not prepared to entertain that danger. But they will accept all kinds of other risks.
Large terrestrial carnivores have experienced some of the most marked declines of any animal group globally as a result of extensive habitat loss and fragmentation. Biological traits such as large body sizes, large area requirements, low densities, and slow population growth rates, alongside intense persecution by humans, make mammalian carnivores particularly vulnerable.
We in the affluent West are expecting many other countries with far less resources than we have, and far denser human populations in some instances, to stop the decline in the numbers of their predators. But we can't reintroduce wolves or lynx or any other predator back into the UK. That just seems to me that we have a responsibility to lead by example, for want of a better term.
Agriculture is the third largest employer in rural Scotland, with 1 in 10 of all Scottish jobs in some way dependent upon agriculture. So whilst the negative impacts of wolf reintroduction may be localised to certain individuals, it cannot be underestimated how far-reaching any declines to the farming industry could be on the wider rural community.
Well, it's socially unacceptable to me that animals can be introduced that will destroy my way of living, the way of living that's been going on in the Highlands for hundreds of years.
The farmer, as such, gets the smallest slice of the the money that's spun round by his business. And that effect, I don't think, can be underestimated on a rural community.
People have had to move away because their employment was destroyed. I want a thriving, busy community which will support schools and shops and post offices. I don't want to see wilderness. To me, there is nothing sadder than going up a glen where there's no sheep, there's no cattle, there's no people. You know, because people are the lifeblood of any area. They just want to get rid of them and replace them with wolves. No.
Species reintroductions offer alternative sources of revenue through enterprise like ecotourism, which could provide direct employment to many local people. Although the long history of farming in the landscape could itself justify resistance among rural communities to consider changes to land use.
The ecotourism that would go with wolf reintroduction, should people be looking towards that side of things? Lots of people will go to wild places in the hope of seeing a particular predator, but their chances of seeing them in certain circumstances is very slim. But it's knowing that they're there that makes all the difference.
I suppose the fact that people have been there and their families have been there within farms for generations probably does have an influence on changing land use.
There's no way that I would even consider letting ground that I've cared for and nurtured be taken over to become a wildlife park.
In the aftermath of previous reintroductions, there exists a clear disconnect between the two opposing groups, namely environmentalists and rural stakeholders. Both need to be able to work together in order for any future projects to succeed.
There's probably a bit of a culture of distrust.
I might be coming at it from a different perspective if I had actually experienced the reintroduction of sea eagles. We tend to find that the kind of people that are into conservation are the wealthy. They don't have to earn their money from the land, and they'll come in and force these ideas on the locals in the north of Scotland, and that is a huge problem.
I think there's a real danger that we categorise each other into conservationist, farmer, sporting estate. Everybody under all those labels actually has quite a lot in common and will often do aspects or involved in aspects of what the other one's doing.
Because farmers are the one industry that needs the thing to renew. Because if you don't grow your crop next year, that's you knackered. So you need to maintain your fertility in your ground and your hill grazings, everything. So there's no desire from any farmer to cause the ecosystem fall apart.
There are no current plans for wolves to be reintroduced to the Scottish Highlands. But given that the reintroduction of wolves could provide major ecological and economic benefits, conservationists need to explore how to reduce costs to individuals for the benefit of society as a whole.
I'm afraid that it is a possibility that they will be reintroduced. The effect it would have on me personally would be probably that I would have to give up farming, and I just could not face the devastation of going out and lifting carcasses every morning after a wolf attack.
Whether wolves will come back to Scotland or not, at the moment I think we're not in a position that we're ready for them. If people were more honest and said, we're planting wolves, and if it doesn't work, we'll take them away in 3 years.
When we reintroduced the beavers into Knapdale in Argyll, it was not a reintroduction project. It was a trial reintroduction. And if after 5 years it was seen not to be appropriate, then the animals would be removed. I would see something like a wolf reintroduction in exactly the same way. We do a trial release first of maybe sterilised individuals or whatever it might be. But the wolves, there needs to be a lot of other mechanisms in place to actually avoid the problem in the first place. So the wolves that you release are not habituated to eating domestic livestock. We have to come up with imaginative and new solutions in a very crowded world.
I simply don't know if wolves will come. I think the reason for that, it needs to be the social space to have these conversations. And at the minute, there's just too much of a gap for it to be a proper, progressive conversation.
The biggest problem that I think most people don't appreciate is that all the discussions that need to take place with the whole range of stakeholders, be it sheep farmers to people who let their little kids walk to school, and those conversations need to happen long, long, long before Wolf 1 gets let out of the box and running around in the Highlands.
The reason we think it won't go away is that there are lots of us who like the idea because of the benefits they bring to a system, because of that kind of cascade effect you get from having a top predator that will give a more balanced ecology to develop, and that's a massive prize. For our landscape to be able to develop itself under natural processes, that's the conservationist dream.